In a small school, there were two students who stood out for very different reasons. One was Jake, the school bully. He was known for his sharp words and quick temper. He always seemed to have a crowd of friends around him, laughing at his jokes and enjoying his attention. Jake loved being the center of attention and was proud of his reputation. He didn't care about the feelings of others, as long as he could make everyone laugh, even if it meant putting others down. He was the type of kid who thought it was fun to make others feel small. Then there was Mark. He was quiet, kind-hearted, and a bit of an introvert. Mark didn't care much for the popularity that Jake had, and he preferred to keep to himself. He wore the same shoes every day, old worn-out shoes that had seen better days. They were faded, with the soles starting to peel off, but Mark didn't mind. He couldn't afford anything new. He was used to being teased because of his shoes, but he kept his head down and tried to ignore the comments. He knew that school wasn't about shoes or looks, it was about learning and growing. One day at school, Jake was walking through the hall, laughing with his friends, when he spotted Mark. Mark was sitting by himself at the edge of the playground, his old shoes clearly visible as he read a book. Jake couldn't resist. He walked over to Mark with a smirk on his face, his friends following behind, eager to see what would happen. "Hey, look at that," Jake said, pointing at Mark's shoes. "Are those from the last century?" His friends chuckled, and Jake took a step closer. "Seriously, man, what are you doing? Can't even afford new shoes. Your feet must be freezing." Mark looked up, his face turning red. He didn't say anything, just glanced down at his shoes and then back at the ground. Jake's words stung, but Mark didn't want to make a scene. The other students nearby started to laugh too, whispering to each other and pointing at him. Jake enjoyed the attention. He could feel the power of making others laugh at someone else's expense. "Hey, I think I've seen those shoes in a museum," Jake teased, and the laughter grew louder. Mark tried his best to ignore them, but deep down, he wished he could just disappear. He wanted to stand up for himself, but he didn't know how. As Jake and his friends walked away, Mark remained silent, his face still burning with embarrassment. He wished things could be different, but for now, he stayed quiet. Mark sat in silence as the teasing continued to echo in his mind. He tried to shake it off, but it was hard. The words kept repeating over and over. Old shoes, pathetic, freezing feet. The more he thought about it, the worse it felt. Mark wasn't used to standing up for himself, especially not against someone like Jake. He wasn't sure how to respond to someone so bold and unkind. That afternoon, when Mark got home, he went straight to his room. He closed the door behind him, hoping the world outside would just disappear. Sitting on his bed, he pulled his shoes off, and stared at them for a moment. They were old, but they had gotten him this far. Still, a part of him felt ashamed. He knew his shoes weren't great, but they had always been good enough for him. His mom knocked on the door and came in. She saw the look on his face, knew something was wrong. "Is everything okay, Mark?" she asked softly. Mark hesitated before speaking. "Kids at school, they made fun of my shoes again." His mom smiled gently. "People don't always understand, sweetheart. Don't let their words define who you are." Mark nodded, but the sting of the teasing still lingered. He wasn't sure how to deal with it, but he knew he had to keep going. The next day, Jake walked into school feeling confident, like he always did. He strutted down the hallway, greeting his friends with his usual cocky smile. He was in a good mood, ready to stir things up again. After all, what was school without a little fun at someone else's expense? Jake found his usual spot near the lockers, surrounded by his friends, all of them laughing and joking about anything they could. He was the leader of the group, and everyone knew it. He had the attention of everyone around him, and he loved it. But as the day went on, Jake began to notice something. His shoes, those shiny, expensive sneakers he'd been so proud of, weren't looking as fresh as they once did. The soles were starting to peel, and there were scuff marks along the sides. It wasn't noticeable at first, but as he walked around, the wear was becoming more obvious. He tried to ignore it, but every time he looked down, he could see it. The feeling was strange. For the first time, Jake felt a bit embarrassed about his shoes. He glanced around to see if anyone else had noticed, but no one was paying attention. Still, something didn't sit right. The laughter from earlier felt different now. He wondered if anyone could see how his shoes were falling apart, just like the ones he'd mocked Mark for. It wasn't just a thought, it was a feeling he couldn't shake. By the time lunch came around, Jake's shoes were starting to make themselves known. As he walked to the cafeteria with his friends, he felt an uncomfortable sensation with every step. The soles of his sneakers were coming loose, and he could feel them flapping against the floor with each stride. His confidence from earlier in the day was starting to fade, replaced by a nagging discomfort he couldn't ignore. Jake tried to hide the damage, quickly adjusting his feet to avoid drawing attention, but his efforts were futile. As he reached the cafeteria, one of his friends, Tom, pointed to his shoes with a raised eyebrow. "Dude, what happened to your shoes?" Tom asked, laughing. Jake stopped dead in his tracks. He looked down, and sure enough, the sides of his sneakers were peeling off. It wasn't just one small scuff, it was the whole sole coming apart. The feeling of humiliation was instant. He could feel his face flush as his friends burst into laughter. "Guess you've got old shoes too now, huh?" one of them teased. Jake's stomach twisted. He tried to laugh it off, but it didn't come out right. The other kids in the cafeteria were starting to notice too. Jake's usual swagger seemed to fade, replaced by the uncomfortable realization that he was now the one being laughed at. The laughter wasn't kind this time. It was the same kind of cruel mockery he had once directed at Mark. As Jake tried to make his way to a table, he couldn't escape the looks and whispers. For the first time he understood what it felt like, to be the one on the receiving end of the teasing. And it didn't feel good at all. As the day dragged on, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of humiliation. Every time he looked down at his shoes, he was reminded of how it felt to be the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. The laughter, the whispers, the stares, it was all too familiar, but now it was directed at him. He had made others feel this way countless times before, and now he was experiencing it firsthand. In between classes, Jake found himself alone in the hallway, staring down at his worn-out shoes. The usual cocky smile was gone. He felt small. It wasn't just about the shoes. It was about how easily people could tear someone down. How easy it was for him to tear others down, without a second thought. His mind drifted back to Mark. The kid with the old shoes, the one he had made fun of just the day before. Jake had laughed at Mark, ridiculed him, and yet now, here he was, feeling the same sting. He had never really thought about how his words affected others until now. Jake knew something had to change. He wasn't proud of how he had acted, but he didn't know how to fix it. He just knew he couldn't keep being the bully. Something inside him was different now. He felt the weight of his actions, and it didn't feel good. The next day, Mark came to school as usual, his old shoes still on his feet. The teasing had hurt, but it didn't define him. He had learned a long time ago that people would say things, but it was up to him whether or not to let it get to him. He kept his head down, focused on his books, and didn't let anyone's words control his mood. He noticed Jake walking through the hall, a bit quieter than usual, his friends whispering amongst themselves. Jake had always been loud and confident, but today, there was something different in his posture. He looked uncertain. Mark didn't know exactly what had happened, but he noticed that Jake seemed less sure of himself than before. At lunch, Mark sat by himself, just as he usually did. He didn't mind the solitude. As he opened his lunchbox, he heard a few students whispering about Jake's shoes. Mark's eyes met Jake's for a brief moment across the cafeteria. Jake quickly looked away, and Mark saw the discomfort in his eyes. It would have been easy for Mark to take this moment to retaliate. To mock Jake for the same thing Jake had done to him. But Mark didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He had learned that real strength wasn't about being loud or causing pain. It was about staying true to who you are. Even when things got tough, Mark didn't need to react. His quiet strength spoke louder than any words could. Over the next few days, Jake found himself acting differently. He wasn't sure what had changed, but something inside him felt different. It was as if the laughter from his friends and the teasing at others didn't give him the same satisfaction anymore. He couldn't look at people the same way, especially after what had happened with his shoes. The way he'd felt, embarrassed and small, made him realize how cruel he had been to others. He couldn't ignore it anymore. One afternoon, after a class, Jake found himself walking over to Mark. Mark was sitting at his usual spot, reading quietly. Normally, Jake wouldn't have thought twice about bothering him, but today was different. "Hey Mark," Jake said, his voice softer than usual. Mark looked up, surprised. "I'm sorry for what I said the other day, about your shoes." Jake hesitated, the words feeling heavy, but he pushed through. "I didn't mean it. I've been thinking about it, and I realized that wasn't cool." Mark looked at him for a moment, unsure if Jake was serious. Jake's face was sincere, and he wasn't laughing. Slowly, Mark nodded. "It's okay," Mark replied quietly. Jake felt a strange sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He knew he couldn't change everything at once, but he was beginning to understand that kindness was far more valuable than the laughs he once got from making fun of others. As the weeks passed, Jake's behavior began to shift. He wasn't the same kid who had once walked through the hallways with his chest puffed out, ready to tear others down for his own amusement. Now he walked a little quieter, his focus less on making others laugh, and more on being genuine. He started helping out in class, picking up supplies that had been dropped, and offering to help students who needed it. His friends noticed the change, and while some were puzzled, others began to follow his lead. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but Jake was starting to build a reputation for kindness, something he had never imagined for himself. Mark, on the other hand, didn't change much. He remained the same quiet, focused student he had always been. He didn't seek attention, and he wasn't looking for validation from others. He knew what it was like to be hurt, but he also knew the strength in moving past it. He focused on his studies, and kept his distance from the drama of school life. He had learned to find peace in himself. Jake never expected forgiveness from Mark, but over time, he noticed that the teasing had stopped. Mark wasn't distant in a bitter way, he simply didn't let the past hold him back. The two never became best friends, but there was a quiet respect between them. The students around them also began to treat each other more kindly, as Jake's transformation became a quiet reminder that words had power, not just to hurt, but to heal. Slowly the school atmosphere shifted, with kindness becoming the new normal.